the best From Software game? First of all, before you make the case for any of them, the answer is probably Dark Souls. Even with its jank, it's hard to beat its superior map design, timeless and thrilling combat, revolutionary storytelling, and man, that hauntingly beautiful title theme. So there you go, case closed, video over, we'll see you in the next one. Alright, jokes aside, in reality, because games and art in general are subjective, the answer is probably all of them. Which is to say, you can probably make the case for why any From Software game is the best one, and I'd probably agree with most of those points. Including even, yeah, Dark Souls 2. We all love a good freak whose favorite FromSoft game is Dark Souls 2. But in terms of bosses, it's hard to beat the memorable lineup from Dark Souls 3. Lore and exploration is supremely rich in both Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree. And of course, art direction and aggressive combat have to go to the generational title that is Bloodborne. As far as From Software games of the last decade are concerned, it's classic after classic after upper echelon classic. All this to say, it's hard to pick just one game from the FromSoft lineup that is most deserving of a follow-up. Certainly not when most of them are, in their own unique way, downright masterpieces. But if there had to be one game that gets any sort of remaster or remake or sequel or literally anything, it should probably be the game trapped at 30 FPS on a console from over a decade ago that, for whatever reason, Sony refuses to acknowledge as part of their catalog worth revisiting. In a world where Days Gone and Horizon get their remasters, yeah, 1000%, Bloodborne should get some kind of follow-up. And yet, I'm here to tell you that it's actually Sekiro that deserves another game. After all, shadows die twice. Welcome to Save Room.
You understand now, don't you, Wolf?
Sekiro is a masterpiece. A flawed masterpiece, much like many of From Software's games. But a masterpiece nonetheless. So, why is it that many people tend to leave it out when talking about the best From Software games? To put it bluntly, it's just straight up hard to claim Sekiro's design as the superior one when compared to much of FromSoft's existing lineup. While Ashina Castle certainly operates as the sort of hub area FromSoft loves to implement in its worlds, returning to the castle never truly feels like the impressive interconnectivity that you can find in something like Dark Souls' Firelink Shrine or even Bloodborne's Central Yharnam. Instead, coming back to Ashina Castle always feels like backtracking a little bit before the wolf races off to explore the next area. The same is true when comparing enemy variety. While Sekiro certainly has its broad enemy types, because of the game's focus on blade weaponry, it does mean you get less ambitious swings in the boss category compared to FromSoft's previous games, not to mention the occasional repeat boss. There are, of course, sublime encounters like the Demon of Hatred or the Divine Dragon, and those are incredible in their own right. But when Bloodborne's bosses range from beasts, witches, and eldritch gods of cosmic horror proportions, fighting middle-aged warriors feels like it sort of pales in comparison. In that regard, Sekiro ends up coming across as perhaps an experimental side project removed from Souls. An ugly duckling combat game only pure sickos like me, and maybe you, can appreciate as the action swan it really is. And maybe some of the design choices have a bit to do with the game originally starting development as an entry in the Tenchu franchise, but at this point we're digressing and getting a bit outside the scope of the video. In reality, these surface comparisons of both map and boss design remove the context of how cathartically sublime Sekiro's combat is as you gradually figure out the rhythm of its core mechanics. Don't get me wrong, literally any From Software game is going to have its cathartic breakthrough of beating what seems like an undefeatable boss. Ornstein and Smough, Orphan of Kaz, fucking Melania and Consort Radahn. But the reality is that this tension exists within all of Sekiro's combat, right down to the smallest of enemies that'll test your patience over and over and over again, the same way, I don't know, a giant headless ape with a massive sword would. Nearly 6 years later, Sekiro still stands out as possibly FromSoft's best combat because of how stripped down the fundamentals of it are while still retaining the studio's thesis of player progression. Except, while their other titles use upgrade systems to level up player stats like health or stamina, Sekiro refuses to rely on more traditional RPG stats and instead forces us to meet the game on its terms. Gone are the dodges and iframes of FromSoft past and present. Instead, it is a combat system built entirely around offense through defensive tactics of blocking, countering, and deflecting to whittle down enemies' posture meters. Fuck chipping at a health bar. Can you instead break down an enemy's guard through pure aggression and perfection? And if you're stuck, then you better go again and again and again until you've drilled the pattern into fingertip muscle memory. In other words, it's you who get better, not your player's stats. It is pure combat stripped down to the fundamentals of steel against steel through and through. Ah, man, and it fucking rips. And like, I'll acquiesce here a bit. Of course, this is going to naturally cause friction that will put off a bunch of people that could consider Sekiro's combat either insurmountable or just straight up way too hard. Like, that's just the truth. But I'd actually argue it's the side of tension that instead makes it both the tightest FromSoft experience from start to finish, while also being one of the more approachable titles, barring any sort of accessibility barrier. There's no extra builds, no grinding for XP, no hunting for overpowered weapons. It's just you, your sword, and your ability to master combat. And once you crack the flow, fighting through an army of soldiers is nothing short of continuous combat adrenaline. I'm obviously not the first person to point out how enthralling Sekiro's combat is. Just about everyone with a video essay on the game will tell you all about how engaging it is to figure out how to avoid or counter perilous attacks like sweeps or Mikiri counters. Indeed, even video essayist and fellow sword boy Jacob Geller has an entire video on Sekiro's combat and how its demand for perfection says a lot about the concept of stuckness in games and in life, and how cathartic and character building it can be to overcome adversity. If you want to hear more about the specifics of Sekiro's core mechanics and what they have to say about you holding the controller, I highly recommend checking out his video. Instead, I want to point out what it's like to be on the other side of stuckness. The side of finishing the game and going back with your knowledge of combat, flow, and muscle memory to completely eviscerate bosses. In short, Sekiro is the ultimate power fantasy. It moves so far away from the traditional combat flow of other Souls games, even the faster ones like Bloodborne, into nearly a godlike character action game, the likes of which you'd see in something like Metal Gear Rising. Into a game where you can deflect even the biggest sword swings with perfect timing, where you can counter perilous attacks with only milliseconds of response time between life and death, and where you can redirect lightning as if it were a weapon in your own arsenal. It's something truly beyond Souls. In fact, I use Sekiro systems as an excuse to talk about action combat pretty much any time I get, because it means I get to go back and get my sword combat dopamine rush when I inevitably need to capture more video. It just scratches some primordial part of my brain literally every single time I pull off one of those counters. So, even though I love Sekiro more than the average From Software fan, in a world where Elden Ring is one of the most popular games of all time, where Dark Souls 3 is looked back on as one of the most perfect boss-to-boss games of all time, and where Bloodborne is still trapped on older hardware, with no news of a remaster anywhere on the horizon, why is it that this game needs another entry more than any of the others? Well, because beyond what you'd suspect, FromSoft has been trending toward developing games closer to character action titles ever since. You just haven't noticed. But if you did notice the slight outfit change, I can explain. I went to go get food. I came back, sat down. I'm just doing the VO in my jacket. Let's relax, people. Back to the rest of the video. A couple of weeks ago, I was lucky enough to get access to the Elden Ring Night Rain network test. Despite some early server issues, I ended up playing that game for nearly a dozen hours just over the course of 2 days. By the end of my first gameplay session, I realized Night Rain wasn't just Elden Ring meets roguelite Fortnite. It was the same combat action power fantasy found in Sekiro. Let me tell you what I mean. Night Rain is Elden Ring if it were pumped with sheer adrenaline. If you aren't familiar with the pitch of the game, it's essentially an Elden Ring multiplayer roguelite combined with the shrinking map element found in any battle royale. You and 2 other Nightfarers land on the map of Limveld that operates on a day/night cycle. Level up and explore during the day, and fight a difficult boss at night, with the goal of a run to fight the final boss at the end of the 3rd day. And because Night Rain operates on a ticking clock, it means FromSoft has opened up the restrictions on builds so that any character can wield any weapon, cast any spell, or hold any item without fear of things like encumbrance or stat restrictions. So, how is this like Sekiro? Because Night Rain has to allow time for both large-scale boss battles and exploring a huge shrinking map, it means traversal needs a radical change. Suddenly, we now have Elden Ring gameplay operating on a much quicker level where characters can sprint at insane speeds, can leap hundreds of feet in the air, can inversely drop hundreds of feet without worry of fall damage, and can close gaps on enemies within seconds. The result is a gameplay style that not only encourages aggression, but rewards it. The more you kill, and the better you are at efficiently doing it, the more likely you are to build an overpowered, god-killing loadout. On top of this are the various character-specific abilities, where you can perform moves like grappling, explosive poise breakers, crowd control wind stops, and invisibility to get major advantages against bosses and regular fodder enemies. All without worrying about any sort of mana meter or limited use, as the abilities slowly recharge. And of course, the more aggressive you are, the faster your abilities recharge. This kind of loop, while still obviously built off the bones of Elden Ring, suddenly resembles something else entirely. It's the aggressive, perfection-rewarding gameplay from Sekiro sans the clashing of steel and Japanese backdrop. This fast, kinetic, victory lap version of Elden Ring is just kind of baseline Sekiro, built off the structure of Souls, but emblematic of adrenaline character action. And the same is sort of true with both FromSoft's other latest game and DLC. It makes sense that Armored Core 6 retains that electric cathartic rhythm from Sekiro since, well, Sekiro's director, Masaru Yamamura, spearheaded development of the newest mech action entry. While swapping out various weapons and parts in a mech is certainly way more systematically involved than fighting with just a single sword, individual duels are still just as mechanically involved. Even in giant robots, it is still just about disabling an enemy's posture. Even Shadow of the Erdtree took inspiration from Sekiro, with the deflecting hard tier trivializing bosses into duels that reward aggression from deflecting incoming attacks, rather than dodging or parrying. Suddenly, nothing is insurmountable that a tap of the block button can't overcome. Look, I know these comparisons are kind of reaching out there a little bit. They aren't definitive translations of the same system found from one game to the next. But what they are is a representation of a design ethos slowly rearing its head since the release of Sekiro back in 2019. FromSoft loves this kind of fast-paced, aggressive fight. They love the difficulty of encountering what seems insurmountable. They love demanding near-perfect inputs learned from dozens of attempts of trial and error. They love the foundation of Sekiro. And I think players love that too. They just don't really know it yet. Slowly but surely, games of the last couple of years have been moving away from the idea of quote-unquote Souls-like. Sure, there are still elements, your bonfire systems, your intense combat, your difficulty, but what we're seeing now is a gradual shift into Souls-like elements within character action titles, where games like Ninja Gaiden can make massive comebacks despite their insane difficulty, and where new games like Phantom Blade Zero or the recent Stellar Blade can borrow elements from Souls but lean toward mechanics of parries and deflects from Sekiro. It is a rise and return of character action inspired by Souls. After all, it's what From Software is currently already doing. Really, it's this philosophy that is on the rise across all games. This idea that it's okay for a game to be demanding of the player in hyper-specific but approachable ways. To meet a game on its terms despite any friction. After all, a game for everyone is a game for no one. Am I right, Helldivers? And it's friction that can often be what makes a game fun in the first place. Sure, I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't want to play a nice new polished up version of Bloodborne on my PS5. But in reality, it's the intense, high demand, electric, cathartic character action that fills me, and I'm sure so many other people, with that gameplay adrenaline. And if that style of gameplay is already trending upward in the zeitgeist, and From Software have been refining what that style of gameplay looks like across all of its IP, then yeah, I think it's time we get another Sekiro. After all, shadows do indeed die twice. Let me know what you think of Sekiro. Is it your favorite From Software game? It's mine. I think? I don't know. They're all my favorite. Do you want another entry in the series? Or are you based, and want another Bloodborne game? I'll be waiting for you down in the comments. Until next time, my name is Christian. This is Save Room. We'll see you in the next one.